"Would you like to have dinner with us?" asked a little girl to the lonely prince sitting alone on Christmas. The snow had started early that morning, falling in slow, steady patterns that softened the sharp corners of the stone buildings and quieted even the sound of footsteps. By afternoon, Velachka Lota was wrapped in white, the rooftops blanketed, the narrow streets layered in uneven paths of powder, and the fir trees bending under the weight of it all. It wasn't a violent snow, but a gentle, persistent one, thick enough to erase lines in the road and soft enough to mute every sound. Even the church bell, which rang faintly in the early hours, had since gone silent. It was December 24th, 1946, and the war had been over for more than a year, though in some ways it still lingered in the way people spoke. Or didn't. That winter had come colder than the last, biting at window panes and freezing the pipes that hadn't been properly repaired since 1939. But the cold wasn't the problem. The silence was. That kind of hush that clung to a town when there was nothing left to sing for. The square, once the heart of the town's life, looked more like a painting than a place. The cobbled stones beneath the snow curved gently toward the fountain in the center, now frozen and draped in icicles that caught no light. A few paper lanterns swayed in the wind, tethered to wooden poles that hadn't been repainted in years. The holiday decorations were sparse. Handmade ornaments hung from a fir tree that leaned ever so slightly to the left, its branches drooping with frost and thin strips of colored ribbon. Someone had tied slices of dried orange to the lower limbs. They looked almost like suns, forgotten by the sky. Most families remained indoors, gathered close to fires that cracked behind stone walls. The air carried no sound of carols, no music, no laughter. Only the groan of old shutters shifting in the wind and the faint creak of boots on fresh snow from the occasional passerby. Even the dogs had gone quiet. Tomasz Radek sat on a wrought-iron bench beneath the tree, a place he'd claimed as his own since the end of the war. He wore the same coat he always wore, long, woolen, dark gray with fraying cuffs and a collar discolored from years of weather and time. The buttons were mismatched, and one was missing entirely, leaving the coat to fold unevenly at the chest. Beneath it, he wore layers of wool and linen, shirts once white, now faded to something between ash and ivory. His boots were black, cracked at the toes, the leather soft from years of wear. They left deep, square prints in the snow beneath his feet. His face was quiet, not blank, but quiet. A face that held memory without inviting conversation. Lines had formed along the corners of his eyes, and a faint scar just above his left brow cut through the paleness of his skin. His hair, dark and slightly curled at the edges, had grown too long at the neck and too short at the crown, as if trimmed in haste or without a mirror. He hadn't shaved in days. He didn't speak. He never did while sitting on that bench. It was a habit he kept, a ritual, though he would never call it that. Before the war, before the reforms, before everything changed, the bench had been placed in the square at his father's request. It faced the church and the manor beyond, and once upon a time, it was where visitors paused to admire the estate. That estate, the Radek family seat, had since been nationalized, stripped of its crests, and converted into a boarding house for teachers, widows, and the displaced. Now, Tomasz lived in a single room on the lower floor of what had once been the West Wing. He worked the grounds with calloused hands and clean tools in the same shed where his family's gardener once kept roses blooming into late autumn. No one had asked him to stay, but no one had asked him to leave either. He came to the square each Christmas Eve because it was the only day no one would ask questions. The others stayed home with their families, their candles, their small meals stretched across long tables. He came for the quiet, or maybe the memory of what had once filled it. The light was beginning to change, slipping from dull silver to something colder. The sun hadn't shown its face all day, hidden behind a sky the color of tin. Still, the snow reflected everything, the branches, the rooftops, the broken lantern posts. And him. A man seated perfectly still, as though carved from the bench itself. He didn't notice the child at first. She came from between two buildings near the bakery, a small figure bundled in a brown coat far too large for her frame. The sleeves covered her wrists and most of her hands. A faded scarf was wrapped tightly around her neck, and her boots, scuffed and mismatched, made soft, hesitant steps in the snow. She was no more than 8, maybe younger, her breath forming short clouds in front of her face as she walked. She stopped several feet from him, silent, still. Tomasz became aware of her presence only in fragments. First the sound of her boots, then the way the air shifted slightly as if bracing for something unfamiliar. He turned his head just enough to see her from the corner of his eye, but said nothing. She didn't speak either. She only looked at him, her cheeks red from the cold, her lips slightly parted. In her hands, she held something small, a wooden figure, crudely carved and chipped at the edges. She stepped forward and extended it toward him. It was a soldier, missing an arm. The paint had peeled from the face, and the base was cracked. Still, it had been held with care. Her voice, when it came, was gentle but clear, carried easily through the stillness of the square. "¿Quieres cenar con nosotros?" The words struck him like a gust of wind. Spanish, though not fluent, he understood enough. Her voice was soft, childlike, but not uncertain. She wasn't reciting. She was inviting. He stared at her, the words settling into the air between them. His hands remained in his coat pockets. His breath fogged the space just before his lips. He didn't answer. Not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't yet. His thoughts had been elsewhere, buried under years of dust and silence. The question had reached a place in him that hadn't been touched in longer than he could measure. He looked down at the soldier, then back at her. She waited, patient but alert, her eyes never leaving his. Then, behind them, a sound broke the quiet. Footsteps, heavier, purposeful, moving across the icy path near the bakery. František Blaha emerged from the alley, his green military-style coat buttoned to the throat, the brim of his cap low over his eyes. He stopped when he saw them, his expression hardening. "Radek," he said, his voice flat but loud enough to carry. "That's close enough." Tomasz blinked. His gaze shifted toward the man, then back to the child, who now looked between the two, uncertain. "You know the rules," František continued. "Tenants and staff don't mix." Tomasz stood slowly, the motion deliberate. Snow dropped from his coat as he straightened. He didn't argue. He never did. His shoulders lifted with the sigh of someone used to following orders too late to change their meaning. He looked once more at the girl. She turned and stepped back toward the path, toward the light spilling from a ground-floor window. The glow was warm, flickering, the kind of light that moved, a fireplace or a candlelit meal. She reached the door, then paused, glancing back. Tomasz hesitated, his breath forming a thin, steady plume in the freezing air. Then, despite František's voice behind him, he took one deliberate step toward the child, and the front door she's now holding open. Tomasz stepped inside. The door clicked shut behind him with a low, muffled thud, cutting off the cold with such suddenness it took a moment for his body to register the shift. Warmth wrapped around him like a blanket, immediate and almost jarring. The air inside was thick, with heat, with scent, with life, and so different from the frozen square outside that he had to steady himself. He stood still, uncertain. The hallway was narrow, paneled in dark wood dulled by age and smoothed at the corners from decades of wear. The floor creaked beneath his boots, and his breath, which had poured visibly into the air just seconds before, now vanished. The scent of food hung everywhere. Boiled potatoes, roasted cabbage, something faintly sweet and charred at the edges. It clung to the walls, seeped through the gaps beneath doors, wove into the fabric of the curtains, and drifted toward him like a quiet invitation. Ahead, the hallway opened into a modest parlor, where flickering light danced along the edges of furniture and the uneven surface of the floor. Somewhere beyond, he could hear the low rattle of firewood in the stove and the clink of porcelain in a sink. Tomasz hesitated at the threshold, unsure how far he was allowed to go. He didn't belong here, not anymore, and the part of him that remembered these rooms when they were his, or something close to his, now ached with discomfort. Footsteps approached from the left. Light, quick. Then a voice called out, not to him, but in the ordinary rhythm of domestic routine. A door opened, and Marta Svobodova emerged from the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, her forearms flushed from the stove. Her dark hair was pulled into a neat twist at the back of her neck, and her blouse was dusted faintly with flour. She stopped when she saw him. The silence that followed was thick and immediate. Marta's expression didn't shift in surprise, not exactly, more in disbelief. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger but in calculation. Behind her, Lucy's small figure appeared, slipping out from behind the edge of the doorframe like a shadow. She looked up at her mother and, with a kind of confidence that seemed entirely her own, said something quiet, words that Tomasz couldn't hear, but that Marta clearly did. For a moment, no one moved. Then Marta's gaze flicked back to Tomasz. Her face didn't soften, but she gave the faintest nod toward the dining table, where 3 ceramic plates sat, one of them without utensils, clearly unclaimed. She stepped aside without a word, leaving a narrow path into the room. It wasn't an invitation, not in the warm sense of the word. It was allowance. A gesture born of obligation, maybe pity, or something even harder to name. Tomasz stepped forward slowly, his boots brushing against the braided rug at the edge of the dining space. The parlor was tight, its ceiling low, its walls bearing signs of war-era neglect, peeling paint around the corners, a water stain that climbed one side of the far window. But it was warm, and it smelled like a home. He removed his coat carefully and draped it over the back of the nearest chair. The heat of the room met the wool of his sweater like 2 strangers negotiating a truce. His fingers, still stiff from the cold, worked slowly to unfasten a button that refused to cooperate. He sat down without comment. Marta returned to the kitchen, her movements swift and mechanical. Lucy climbed onto the chair opposite him, kicking her boots lightly against the legs. She didn't speak again right away. She simply watched him, her head tilted slightly, like someone studying a painting. Dinner was served in silence. Marta placed a ceramic bowl in front of him, vegetable soup, thin and steaming, with slices of potato and ribbons of cabbage. Beside it, a piece of coarse bread. A shared plate of dumplings rested in the center of the table, half covered with a cloth to preserve their heat. It was a meal stretched far beyond its means. Rationed ingredients, cleverly disguised. The kind of food born of habit and careful hands. No one offered a toast or a prayer. They simply ate. Tomasz kept his eyes low. He answered when spoken to, nothing more. Marta asked if he needed salt, and he said no. Lucy asked if he liked soup, and he said yes. Her questions came in slow trickles, cautious at first, then more freely, like stones skipping across a lake. Did he live alone? Did he like snow? Did he have any books? Marta interjected once or twice, telling her gently to eat, but never too harshly. It was clear she was watching him just as much as Lucy was. Watching how he held his spoon, how he chewed, how long he looked at the picture on the wall. It was an old photograph, framed in black wood, slightly tilted where the nail held uneven weight. A young man in uniform stared from behind the glass, cap squared on his head, eyes direct and unreadable. He looked barely older than Tomasz had been during the first wave of the war. The image had been touched by time, a small crease along the edge, the silver finish slightly dulled. But the man's face remained clear. A dried sprig of mistletoe hung beside it, tied with a red ribbon now faded to rust. Beneath it, a chipped glass candle holder flickered with a single flame, its light casting thin shadows up the wall. The entire room seemed to orbit that image, not as decoration, but as presence. Tomasz looked at the photograph for only a second, but it was long enough for Marta to notice. Something in his posture changed, a tightening of the jaw, A pause mid-chew. A glance taken quickly, then dropped. Lucy continued to talk. She spoke of school, of the snow, of a drawing she'd made of the square and the tree. Her voice was bright, but it never rose too far. There was something careful about the way she spoke, as though aware of the limits her mother would tolerate. The meal came to a quiet end. Marta collected the plates, stacking them neatly before disappearing into the kitchen once more. The clatter of dishwashing followed, steady and practiced. Lucy leaned across the table, placing her elbows just at the edge, her fingers folded in front of her. The lights flickered. It was quick, a blink, maybe two, but unmistakable. The room dimmed, then flared back to life, then dimmed again. This time the electricity failed entirely. The ceiling bulb hissed and faded to black. Marta returned almost immediately, her hands already reaching for the candles on the sideboard. She moved with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. Matches struck, wicks lit, flames steadying into place. Within seconds, the room glowed again, this time softer, the edges blurred. The shadows on the walls swayed like quiet dancers. The entire space seemed older somehow, like it had slipped back in time. Lucy clapped her hands softly, delighted by the candlelight. She asked for a story, a real one, she said. Not one from the radio or the books at school. Something old. Tomasz didn't answer right away. He looked toward Marta, who returned his gaze without expression, then lowered her eyes and took a seat beside her daughter, folding her arms across her chest. He cleared his throat. The story came slowly at first, the voice of someone unaccustomed to being listened to. But as the tale unfolded, a bohemian folk story of a shoemaker who tricked a greedy king into giving away his gold, his tone shifted. It became steadier, richer. The characters took shape in the air, their voices distinct, their world drawn with language and gesture. The king grew more foolish with each passing page of the imaginary book. The shoemaker, clever and kind, found ways to twist the greed back on itself. Lucy leaned forward, eyes wide. Marta, though composed, gave in to the rhythm of it. Her arms relaxed, her mouth softened. When the story ended, silence followed, not awkward, but full. The wind outside had grown stronger. It scratched at the shutters with thin, seeking fingers. Inside, the candle flames flickered, bending under the drafts. The room felt smaller now, as if holding its breath. Marta leaned forward, her arms folded again but less tightly. She looked at Tomasz for a long moment before she spoke. Her voice was quiet, but certain. Curious, not hostile. She asked him who he really was. Tomasz's face tightened. His hands, resting on the tabletop, didn't move. The candlelight caught the curve of his cheek, the hollow beneath his eyes. Outside, the wind rose again, sharper this time, rattling the shutters in a long, low groan. With a voice that barely rose above a whisper, he spoke a name. One that hadn't been uttered in years, not even by him. The name settled into the space between them like frost against cold glass, silent and still, but impossible to ignore. Tomasz Radek, of the House of Czerny-Hvozd. Marta reacted as if struck. Her chair scraped loudly against the floor as she pushed it back with a sudden, sharp motion. A glass on the table tipped, water spilling in a narrow line toward the edge, but she didn't notice. Her breath caught, not in awe, but in disbelief. The candlelight flickered as she stood, casting her profile into momentary relief. There was skepticism in her expression, something harsher too. The hard edge of old knowledge wrapped in caution. That name doesn't mean anything here, she said, her voice low and clipped. Not anymore. Lucy looked between them, confused but alert. Marta kept her gaze fixed on Tomasz. You think it earns you something? You think you can sit at my table and speak fairy tales to my daughter and pretend we don't remember what titles like yours used to mean? She shook her head. We had no bread while your name hung on a crest. People like you had floors polished with coin while others fought to feed their children. Tomasz didn't interrupt. The words came fast, but not reckless. They were sharp, intentional. Not shouted, but certain. He waited until the silence returned, until Marta's arms crossed tightly over her chest, and Lucy looked down at her hands, the heat in the room suddenly heavier. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than before. "Yes," he said. "That was my name. It still is. But it means nothing now." He didn't raise his eyes. "I'm not that man anymore. I'm what you see, a caretaker in a house that no longer belongs to me. That name is bones in the ground." Neither Marta nor Lucy responded. The room had shifted, something broken loose from its moorings. Outside, the wind continued to press against the windows, but the shutters held. No one said another word that night. Tomasz stood, pulled on his coat, and left without looking back. By morning, the snow in the square had frozen into jagged crusts, and the air had dropped to a biting chill. A thin mist clung to the ground in the early light, and smoke rose sluggishly from chimneys across the town. Tomasz walked toward the tool shed behind the manor with slow, deliberate steps. He hadn't eaten. The garden that once bloomed with roses now lay dormant beneath a brittle skin of frost. The same place where his mother had once walked in summer mornings, where his father read on the stone bench, now just silence and dead stems. František was waiting near the shed. His coat was buttoned to the neck, his cap pulled low, his stance square. His breath formed short bursts in the cold. He didn't waste time. "You told them your name," he said. "You couldn't leave it alone." Tomasz didn't reply. František took a step forward. "Do you think this is some storybook town that needs a prince to save it? They let you work here. That was mercy enough." Still, Tomasz said nothing. František's voice dropped to something quieter, but colder. "You're done here. End of the week. Pack your things." He turned and walked away, the sound of his boots crunching hard over the snow. That night, Tomasz lit a lamp in his small room and opened the trunk beneath his bed. He moved slowly. His hands, though steady, seemed to hesitate with each object he touched. A wool sweater, folded years ago and never worn, a leather shaving kit missing its blade, a single photograph, corners curled, the image faded, a younger version of himself standing beside a fireplace that no longer stood, flanked by faces now lost to time. He packed methodically. A small suitcase sat open on the bed. Inside, 2 shirts, the photograph, a bundle of letters tied with old string, and a coat that no longer fit the way it used to. There was not much else. The lamp cast long shadows against the walls, flickering now and then as the oil burned low. He sat for a moment on the edge of the bed, listening to the creak of the boards beneath him, to the faint clatter of wind against the windows. Outside the door, a narrow beam of light flickered. Lucy stood in the hallway, pressed against the frame, watching through a small crack. She didn't move, didn't speak. She only watched, her face still, her hands clasped in front of her. She saw him fold the sweater. She saw the way he handled the letters, with care, almost reverence, and how long he stared at the photograph before sliding it into the bag. She slipped a folded note under the door just before dawn. It was made from a scrap of drawing paper, written in pencil, folded twice. He didn't find it. Instead, she waited until morning, her boots half-laced, her scarf loose around her neck. She stood outside his door until it opened, then stepped into the narrow hallway, blocking his path. He stopped short. "I don't care what your name is," she said, her voice steadier than it should have been. "I don't care about old castles or stories from before the war. You told me a story when it was dark. You looked at me when no one else did. That's what matters." Her words were simple, but they carried weight. "I know you're leaving," she added, "but please don't go." Tomasz looked at her, and for the first time, there was something in his face. Not emotion exactly, but something struggling beneath the surface. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He lowered his eyes. Behind her, footsteps sounded on the stairs. Marta appeared, her coat already on, a scarf wrapped tight around her shoulders. Her face was pale, drawn, unreadable. She held something in her hands. She stepped forward, stopping just beside Lucy. Her voice was even, measured. "Before you go, there's something you should see." Marta said nothing more as she stepped past Tomasz and Lucy, her hand tightening around the spine of the notebook she carried. The hallway was still dim with early morning light, the walls painted in dull grey-blue by the snow reflecting through the frost-covered windows. Without looking back, she led them toward the parlor, her pace steady but restrained, as if she were holding back something larger than motion. Tomasz followed, uncertain. He hadn't touched the handle of his suitcase again. Lucy trailed a step behind him, quiet but close. The narrow corridor creaked beneath their weight, the wooden floor bending gently beneath the worn rug that ran along its center. The air was warm, the kind of warmth that came from hours of burning coal and soup left on the stove. It carried with it the familiar scent of boiled cabbage and ash. The parlor had changed little since the night he had sat at their table. The small tree still stood beside the fireplace, its branches now drooping slightly, the ornaments of wood and threadless buttons swaying as the air shifted. A candle burned low in the chipped glass holder beneath the portrait of the soldier. Its wax pooled thick around the base. The same man watched them from above the room, his face fixed in the eternal stillness of the photograph. Marta crossed to the table and placed the notebook down gently. The leather cover was worn, edges soft from use, the corners darkened with oil and age. She didn't open it. She stepped back, leaving it between them as something that belonged to both and neither. "It was his," she said simply, nodding toward the book. "He wrote in it during the war. Not for anyone else. Just for himself." Tomasz stood at the edge of the table, his fingers brushing the cover but not yet opening it. Something in him resisted, not out of fear but reverence. It had been years since he'd touched anything like it. Not official reports, not censored letters, but something personal, something real. He looked at Marta. She gave a small nod and stepped away, leaving him to decide. He opened it. The pages crackled faintly, dry but intact. The handwriting was tight, efficient, the script of a soldier trained to conserve space and ink. There were notations in shorthand, sometimes coded, dates pressed into the margins like anchors to reality. Names appeared and vanished, places scribbled then crossed out. Much of it was routine. Positions held, supplies distributed, small losses, weather reports. But deeper in the journal, the tone shifted. The language became less clinical, the sentences longer, more searching. The entries moved into late winter of 1943, near the Carpathians. And here, Tomasz paused. The words described the cold first, not as numbers, but as something alive. "The snow is a thief," the writer had scrawled. "It takes the sound first, then the sense of time, then the men." He spoke of frost-bitten hands and eyes that no longer blinked, of boots frozen to the ground, and of mornings when they dug the dead from snowbanks without knowing their names. Tomasz's breath slowed. He turned another page, then another. There it was, a single entry marked only with the words, "North Slope, 17 kilometers west of Veliki Berezny." Beneath that, the writer had circled a phrase. "He never told us his name. We called him the Prince because of the way he spoke." Not like an officer, not like a preacher, but like someone who remembered warmth. Tomasz stood very still. He turned the page again. The handwriting was more rushed, almost frantic in places. "Dug alongside us, ate what we ate, slept where we slept." He refused the officer's tent, said nothing about his past, shared his coat with a boy who was coughing blood. His boots were too fine for the mud, but he never complained. I don't know why he was there, but I believe he saved us. Just by staying. Marta stepped forward slowly, pointing to the bottom of the page. "I read this many times," she said. "He wrote it before he was transferred. He never told me who that man was. But I know now." Tomasz didn't speak. The paper in his hands trembled, though the air in the room was still. A memory broke loose, uninvited. Firelight in a frozen hollow. Wet branches crackling in a makeshift pit. Men curled into themselves like fallen animals, wrapped in blankets too thin and memories too sharp. A boy, barely 20, stumbling into camp with blood on his sleeve, eyes wide with fear. Tomasz had taken him by the arm, helped him strip the coat from his back to wrap around the boy's shoulders. He hadn't spoken his name. None of them had. He remembered the weight of that body half carried through the snow. He remembered the sound of breath too shallow to count, the silence when they finally crossed the ridge and met the signal patrol. He had let go of the boy's arm then. Never learned his name. Had turned back toward the trench without a word. He closed the notebook slowly. Lucy had entered without them noticing. She slid onto the bench beside her mother, her legs swinging just above the floor. Her eyes were wide, but calm, hands folded neatly in her lap. Marta opened the journal again and turned to the final entry. The handwriting was different. It looked rushed, uncertain, written in the last days of that season. She read aloud, her voice steady despite the emotion gathering beneath it. If you find him, the man who had no crown but still gave everything, thank him for me. Silence filled the room. The candle on the table flickered once, then held. Tomasz stared at the notebook. His fingers rested lightly against its cover, no longer trembling but still. Marta didn't apologize. She didn't offer more than what she'd already given. But her stance changed, her shoulders lowered, her arms no longer crossed. Something in her had softened, just enough to be seen. He never told me what happened that winter, she said. Only that someone helped him when he should have died. That it wasn't just medicine or shelter, but something else. Something that made him want to come home. She paused. What matters isn't what you were born into. It's what you did when it was taken from you. Tomasz didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed on the journal, and for a long moment, nothing in the room moved. Then he stood, slow and quiet. The air had grown cooler again, the fire shrinking into low coals. Lucy watched him, but didn't speak. Marta stepped aside as he turned toward the hallway, one hand brushing the edge of the table for balance. His eyes were glassy. Something deep in him had shifted, and though he didn't say it, the weight of that winter had returned. Not in pain, but in recognition. He had taken 2 steps toward the door when hurried footsteps echoed from the corridor, fast and sharp. František burst into the room, his breath heavy, coat open, an envelope clenched in one fist, already torn at the top. They know who you are, and they're coming. František's words still rang in the air as the envelope crackled between his fingers, the red stamp of the regional office visible even from across the room. The seal, circular, bearing the emblem of the Civic Committee, looked as though it had been pressed with particular weight, the ink bleeding slightly into the paper. He didn't wait to be asked. He stepped forward and laid the document on the table beside the field journal, sliding it across with the edge of his hand, like it burned to touch. Tomasz stared at it without moving. The page was official in tone, filled with the stiff, bureaucratic language that disguised itself as clarity, but offered none. The phrases leapt from the parchment with the cold sharpness of an accusation dressed in politeness. An inquiry has been initiated regarding Mr. Tomasz Radek, formerly of titled nobility, now residing in Walaszka Lota, in connection with suspected ideological conflict and the potential disruption of public order. František didn't sit. He remained standing, his hands stiff at his sides, eyes never leaving Tomasz. His voice was low, firm. You've drawn attention, whether you meant to or not. He gestured toward the document. They'll send someone soon, maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow. Doesn't matter. You won't be here when they do. Lucy looked up at him, her mouth parting slightly, but no words came. Marta stepped forward, placing a hand gently on her daughter's shoulder. What does that mean? Marta asked, her voice tightly controlled. František's expression didn't change. It means he goes now, before the town becomes a footnote in someone else's report. I'll not have this house questioned because of a name that should have stayed buried. He turned and left the room without waiting for a reply, his boots striking the floor with the practiced force of a man used to enforcing quiet authority. The door clicked shut behind him. Tomáš stood motionless. The document remained on the table, its message simple in what it refused to state outright. You do not belong here. Not anymore. By midday, the notice had been posted in the common hallway on the ground floor of the boarding house. František pinned it to the bulletin board beside the schedule for coal deliveries and the faded list of ration allocations. The tenants gathered slowly, drawn not by curiosity, but by the sound of official language unfolding in ink. They read in silence. No one said Tomáš's name aloud, but it rippled through the room nonetheless. In twos and threes, they broke apart. Some went back to their rooms, others lingered. A few glanced upstairs, toward the corridor that led to the west wing. No one approached him directly, but their eyes followed, measured, guarded. As the day stretched forward, the temperature dropped again, and the building's mood shifted with it. A woman who had once offered Tomáš an extra slice of bread in the kitchen avoided him now in the hallway. A schoolteacher he'd greeted every morning passed him in silence. Even the old man who played cards by the stove turned his back as he approached. Only Lucy remained unchanged. She continued to speak to him in passing, leaving small drawings folded beneath his door or tucked between the pages of books left in the common room. Marta, however, had grown quieter. She said little beyond what was necessary, though she never turned him away. By late afternoon, Tomáš could no longer stay inside. He stepped into the manor's west wing, the corridor where no one else went now, where the boards creaked too loudly and the light came in only through broken shutters. The dust was thick in the air, stirred by his presence. It clung to everything, the half-torn wallpaper, the once polished wainscoting, the doors that no longer opened fully. He passed what had once been his childhood bedroom. The handle resisted at first, but then gave way with a reluctant sigh. The room beyond was unchanged, not in preservation but in abandonment. Furniture draped in linen, warped from moisture. The outline of picture frames left faint rectangles on the walls. A bed frame stood crooked against the far corner, its mattress long gone. Tomáš stepped to the dresser and pulled open the top drawer. The handle came loose in his hand, but the drawer opened anyway. Inside, among yellowed scraps of paper and a dried sprig of lavender, was a small porcelain lion, no longer than a child's hand. Its glaze had chipped at the base, one paw broken and glued back on at some point long before. He picked it up carefully and turned it over in his palm. The porcelain was cold, but smooth. The weight was slight but real. He slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat without a word. The snow began again just before sunset. The square was empty. No footsteps, no music, no voices. The paper lanterns still hung from the posts, though several had collapsed under the weight of the weather, their paper soggy and torn. The fir tree stood with its handmade ornaments of thread and wood, its branches bowed under the new weight of snowfall. Tomáš sat on the same bench he always had, the one facing the church, angled slightly toward the house. His coat was pulled tight against the wind. His breath came in soft clouds, dissolving quickly into the night air. He hadn't brought the suitcase with him. The snow fell steadily, thick flakes settling on his shoulders, in his hair. He didn't brush them off. Lucy appeared without sound. She walked across the square wearing boots that left shallow prints behind her, her scarf dragging a little behind one shoulder. In her hands was a crown, made from yellowed drawing paper, cut unevenly and taped in 3 places. She'd drawn lines along the edge to mimic jewels, and a small sun near the center. The crown bent slightly as she held it. She said nothing as she approached. She simply reached out and placed it gently on his lap, then stepped back. Tomáš looked down at it, unmoving. "It's for you," she said finally. "Not because you were a prince." She hesitated. Because you were kind. He didn't respond. Not right away. He looked at the paper crown, its creases and careful construction, its fragile beauty. He reached out and touched it with the tips of his fingers, holding it in both hands. He didn't know whether to laugh or to cry. As he lowered the crown into his lap, the knock came, sharp and deliberate, echoing from the boarding house door across the square. The sound of a gloved hand against wood, steady and official. A car had arrived. The knock came again, firmer this time. 3 measured raps against the boarding house door, then silence. Snow clung to the narrow street, the only light now coming from the windows above, muted through frost-laced glass. Tomasz remained seated on the bench, Lucy beside him, her breath rising in slow, even puffs. He held the folded crown in his lap, his hand still resting on the worn paper, now damp at the corners. Through the window they saw the silhouette of František moving toward the door. The heavy hinges groaned as it opened. A man stepped inside, the snow gusting briefly in behind him. He was young, perhaps no older than 30, with a pale, drawn face and a closely trimmed mustache that seemed too formal for the softness of his chin. He wore a long charcoal wool coat that hung stiffly around his frame, the buttons polished and the fabric thick with state-issue pride. A leather-bound satchel hung at his side, and tucked beneath his arm was a small ledger, bound in red twine. He removed his gloves with care, tucking them into his coat pocket before shaking František's hand. "I am Officer Zelenka, from the Regional Committee for Civic Order," the man said, his voice clipped, rehearsed. František nodded, leading him into the parlor. The fire had long since died to embers, and the room was lit only by a single overhead bulb and the flickering candles on the windowsill. A few tenants had gathered, pretending to read, or to sew, or simply to pass through, but their eyes drifted toward the newcomer with open curiosity. František produced the letter, the one with the red seal, and laid it carefully on the table. His voice lowered, sharpened. "I warned him," he said. "Tried to handle it quietly, but the man's presence has stirred tension. Some of the others think he means to restore what was taken. He speaks kindly, but that's how it begins. Soft words, old ideas. He doesn't deny who he was." Officer Zelenka listened without interruption, nodding once or twice. He pulled out his ledger and began to write, the scratch of his pencil the only sound for several long seconds. "Has he incited religious gatherings?" the officer asked without looking up. "No," František replied. "Political meetings? Criticism of the regional party office?" "No," František repeated, slower this time. "But he's telling stories, making people remember what they were meant to forget. That's worse." The officer stopped writing. He looked up. "I'll speak with him now." František hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside, motioning toward the rear of the room. Tomasz had entered quietly, his coat still dusted with snow. He paused near the doorway, eyes scanning the room, then stepped forward when summoned. He offered no greeting, only a slow nod before taking the empty seat across from Officer Zelenka. The room fell silent. Several tenants lingered nearby, standing just beyond earshot, pretending to busy themselves with chores or idle conversation. But their ears were turned, their hands still. Even Marta, standing at the threshold of the hallway, remained rooted in place, her arms crossed tightly, Lucy beside her. The officer opened his ledger again, adjusting his posture. The questions came without inflection, each one precise. "State your name." "Tomasz Radek." "Place of birth?" "Cherny Hvozd, near the border." "Former occupation?" Tomasz paused. "Formerly a landholder, now a groundskeeper." "Titles previously held?" A longer pause. "Prince, in name, before the reforms." "Do you acknowledge that such titles no longer hold legal standing in the Republic?" "I do." "Do you claim those titles still?" "I remember them. I do not use them." Officer Zelenka scribbled. The candlelight caught the sweat at his temple, though the room remained cold. He flipped the page. Have you spoken to the residents here about restoring any past authority, nobility, monarchy, or church? No. Have you distributed material that references pre-revolutionary values? No. Have you spoken of religion? I told a story, Tomasz said, his voice steady. A folk tale. It wasn't about religion or politics. It was about generosity. The officer paused for the first time, tapping the tip of his pencil against the page. Do you believe the current government has failed to protect its people? I believe every government struggles, Tomasz said, but I don't speak against it. I dig the soil. I keep the fences mended. I don't preach. Do you still believe you are above the people here? No, Tomasz answered, the words spoken simply, without bitterness. I live among them. That's all. The pencil stopped. The officer closed the ledger. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of unasked questions. The officer leaned back, his gaze sharp but not unkind. For a moment, something flickered in his expression. Uncertainty, perhaps. He stood, adjusted his coat, and looked briefly around the room. I will file my report, he said. You will remain under observation. František stepped forward, his mouth half open. No action will be taken at this time, the officer said, cutting him off. But the matter is not closed. His continued presence here is provisional. With that, he turned and walked out, his boots clicking crisply against the floor. The door closed behind him with a dull thud, and the room exhaled. No one spoke for several minutes. František stood motionless beside the table, the official report still open before him. His jaw twitched once, then settled. He gathered the papers slowly, folding them with more care than seemed necessary. Tomasz remained seated for a moment longer, then stood and left the room. Marta didn't follow. Neither did František. That night the town fell quiet again beneath a new veil of snow. The lanterns in the square dimmed early, and no one spoke of what had happened. It was a silence that didn't hide anything, but rather held it in place. Tomasz walked through the old churchyard, where the graves bore names too faded to read. The snow softened his steps as he moved among the markers, his breath clouding in the cold air. The wind had stilled, and the trees along the stone wall stood frozen in place. Lucy found him near the low bench beneath the birch trees. She said nothing as she approached, only held out a new paper crown, this one colored with pencil, tiny stars lining the rim. It looked fragile in her hands, but she held it like it was made of gold. He took it with both hands and nodded, his throat too tight for words. Back at the boarding house, Marta sat at her desk, the journal open before her. She read the last few entries again, her finger tracing the edge of the paper. When she closed the book, she did so slowly, then stood and slid it between two textbooks on the shelf above her bed, the place she kept the things that mattered most. Downstairs, František sat alone at the kitchen table, the officer's report laid flat in front of him. He stared at it for a long time, the candle burning low beside him, the room growing colder by degrees. The words hadn't brought the conclusion he'd expected. They'd only stirred more waiting. The next morning, just after sunrise, he climbed the stairs and knocked on Marta's door. When she opened it, he didn't step inside. His voice was clipped, expression unreadable. You're under review now, for harboring someone of political concern. If you continue defending him, you risk losing your position and your home. By midday, the news had spread far beyond the boarding house walls. It started with whispers at the market stall, passed between hands exchanging turnips and salt. The tone was hushed but urgent, voices lowered not out of courtesy, but from the weight of implication. By the time the butcher's wife told the school janitor, who in turn repeated it to the woman who lit the stove at the council building, it had grown beyond fact. What had been a formal visit from a junior official became, in retelling, a secret investigation. A search, an interrogation. Some said Tomasz had been summoned to the capital. Others said he'd refused. One woman claimed he was plotting to reclaim his family's estate, drawing up papers in the middle of the night. Another insisted he'd been seen in the churchyard with a group of men after curfew, though the only figure in the churchyard that night had been Lucy, carrying a paper crown. Truth, wrapped in too much quiet and not enough explanation, crumbled beneath fear and invention. It was easier to believe in conspiracy than kindness. Easier to believe the past was rising again, cloaked in silence. By the following morning, the council had called a meeting. It would be held at dusk in the old town hall, a building more symbolic than functional. Its tall windows were permanently clouded by frost, and the walls bore the faded outlines of long-removed portraits. The ceiling, once pale blue, had darkened to the color of smoke, and the wooden floors creaked like a tired man's joints. A rusted coat rack leaned by the front entrance, and the stove in the corner sputtered more than it warmed. Still, people came. Not in crowds, but in steady, deliberate pairs. Shopkeepers, schoolteachers, widows, men from the mill. No one arrived quickly, but no one stayed away either. Tomasz did not arrive with them, neither did Marta. František stood near the front of the room, adjusting the collar of his coat as Brother Emil set up a folding table for the council members. A few others, older residents who had lived in Valashka Lota since before the First War, took their places along the front row, their backs stiff against the cold. A sheet of paper, blank save for a heading and several lines, sat ready for notes. When the meeting began, the air inside was thick and unmoving. No fire burned in the stove. A single oil lamp had been lit near the council table, casting the rest of the room into low shadow. František spoke first. He stepped forward without introduction, his hands folded behind his back, his voice firm. "This meeting was not called out of hatred," he began, "nor from ignorance. It was called because this town, our town, is trying to move forward. We have spent years rebuilding from what was taken, and we must ask ourselves whether the presence of a man who bears the name of a fallen house helps that progress, or hinders it." There were murmurs. A few heads nodded. František glanced around the room, then continued. "He has said nothing dangerous, not openly, but his presence, his name, reminds people of the way things were, and not everyone remembers that time as fondly as a child might. Some of us remember hunger. We remember when nobility meant silence and obedience." He paused. A draft moved through the back of the room. "I am not asking for punishment," he said, "only for order. Let him go where his name means something. This is not that place anymore." He stepped back. No one clapped. But the silence that followed felt closer to approval than resistance. One of the older residents, a woman with gray hair tucked tightly beneath a headscarf, raised her hand and was called forward. She spoke slowly, her voice soft, but audible. "I have lived here all my life," she said. "I remember the house when it had lights in every window. I remember the garden and the music in the square. I remember his father." She hesitated. "I also remember what we didn't have, what we were not allowed to ask for. I don't hate him, but I don't forget either." Another voice rose next, a man who worked at the mill. He shifted from foot to foot as he spoke. "He keeps to himself. He's never asked for favors, never even raised his voice. But he carries something with him. A shadow, maybe. I don't know. It's not what he does. It's what he is. And maybe that's enough." There were more nods. Then a seamstress from the boarding house stood. "I've seen him fix the gate 3 times this winter. No one asked him to. He just did it. And when my daughter lost her scarf, he found it in the snow and left it at our door. No note. Just left it." Her voice tightened. "I don't care what his name used to mean. He's kind." Someone coughed. The wind pressed faintly against the windows. Marta hadn't spoken. She stood at the back of the room, her arms crossed, Lucy beside her, quiet and alert. The room waited. She stepped forward. Her voice didn't tremble. "I'd like to tell you something," she said. "Something I didn't know until recently. My husband, some of you knew him, kept a journal during the war. I only read it last week." The room stilled. "In one entry," she continued, "he described a winter campaign in the mountains. Cold so deep it stole your breath before you could speak. He was wounded during an ambush. Would have died if someone hadn't pulled him from the snow." She paused, eyes sweeping the room. "He wrote about a man, a stranger, a prince without a name. Someone who gave up his warmth, his food, his rank, to save a soldier he'd never met." She took a breath. "That soldier was my husband." Silence gripped the room. No one knew who the man was. Not until now. Not until that story matched the man living quietly in our boarding house. He never mentioned it. Never once asked to be thanked. Marta looked down, then up again. "We all carry the past with us. Some carry it like armor, others like weight. He carries it with grace." She stepped back. There were no more voices. No one moved. Brother Emile rose next, asking the council to confer. The members, 5 in all, leaned in, speaking in hushed tones, their faces drawn, their expressions unreadable. The discussion lasted only a minute or two. When they turned back to the room, the elder at the center spoke. "The council has decided that Tomasz Radek may remain. No action will be taken at this time." There was no applause, only silence. František stood slowly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply looked around the room, eyes resting briefly on Marta, then on Brother Emile. "I cannot manage a house that forgets its place," he said. And then he turned and walked out, the door closing behind him with a hollow, echoing sound. The room exhaled. People began to gather their coats, their hats, stepping back into the cold, into the dark, snow-covered street. No one spoke loudly. No one looked at Tomasz, who had stood at the rear of the room the entire time. He stepped forward now, his face unreadable. His voice, when it came, was calm, measured, unshaken. "I can't stay," he said. "If staying means dividing the place that gave me shelter, then I've already stayed too long." He looked once toward Marta, then to the others. "I'll leave Valaška Lota." Tomasz returned to the manor without speaking to anyone. The square was empty behind him, the windows dark, the snow deepening with each hour. The lamp outside the boarding house flickered under the weight of frost, its light no longer strong enough to reach the edges of the courtyard. Inside, the corridors were hushed. No laughter, no footsteps, only the distant creak of settling floorboards and the faint hiss of wind curling between old glass panes. He entered through the side door near the garden, the same one he used every morning before the others woke. His boots left a thin trail behind him, prints disappearing into shadow. The hallway was dim. One bulb cast a tired yellow glow above the coat hooks. His room was at the end of the corridor, a narrow space beneath the stairwell, just wide enough for a bed, a trunk, and a chair. He didn't turn on the light. The suitcase was already packed. It sat beside the trunk where he'd left it, its leather scuffed and worn, the handle wrapped in twine to keep it from splitting. He reached for it slowly, the motion deliberate. Each sound in the room, the whisper of cloth, the creak of leather, felt louder than it should. His fingers brushed the folded paper crown that rested on the shelf above the cot. It had dried stiff, its penciled stars faint beneath the folds. The tape had begun to peel. He looked at it for a moment, then turned and walked back through the hallway toward the common room, his steps steady, though something in him pulled backward. The fire still burned there, low, quiet, the last embers glowing behind the iron grate. Shadows reached across the walls in long, soft arcs, and the air held the scent of smoke and ash. The mantel was bare, save for a few old candlesticks and a cracked ceramic clock that no longer ticked. Tomasz placed the paper crown on the center of the mantel. He adjusted it slightly, aligning the peaks. The light from the hearth flickered across its edge, casting a silhouette that trembled but did not fall. At the edge of the stairwell, Marta stood watching. She didn't move. Her arms were crossed, her expression unreadable in the half-dark. The flame caught the line of her cheekbone, the faint hollow beneath her eyes. She made no sound, and Tomasz did not speak to her. He simply nodded once, not a goodbye, but something quieter. He turned toward the door. Lucy came running after him. She was barefoot, her nightgown too long, sleeves pushed up as if in a hurry. Her small feet landed softly on the cold floor, each step silent but full of purpose. Her hair was loose, falling in uneven waves around her shoulders. She held out a folded piece of paper with both hands. Tomasz knelt to her level. Her eyes, wide and serious, held his without fear. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He took the paper gently and unfolded it. Inside was a drawing, crayon and charcoal, of the dinner table. 3 figures sat around it. 1 tall, 1 medium, and 1 small. The tallest had a crown on his head. Tomasz looked at it for a long moment. Then he folded it again, carefully, and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat. He touched her shoulder, just once, then rose. The door creaked as he pulled it open. The wind pushed in immediately, bringing with it the heavy scent of snow. It clung to everything, the air, the floor, his breath. He stepped outside, closing the door behind him with care. The snow had grown heavier, wet and thick, sticking to his coat, to his hair, melting at the collar only to refreeze moments later. His boots sank into the slush, each step a soft crunch beneath him. He passed the square, now barely visible beneath the white. The fir tree bowed deeper than before, the ornaments hidden beneath layers of ice. The bench where he had sat so many nights was already covered, his footprints from earlier in the day erased. He followed the narrow path toward the station at the edge of town. The road bent slightly, climbing a shallow rise before descending toward the rail yard, where the metal tracks curved between snowbanks and empty freight cars sat under tarps. The train wouldn't come until morning. He knew that. He didn't plan to board. Past the depot building, he found the old storage room near the coal yard, a wooden structure with a crooked door and a rusted lock that no longer held. Inside, it was cold but dry, the floor scattered with straw and broken crates. A single oil lamp hung from a nail on the wall, flickering weakly against the wind. He set his suitcase down beside the bench and looked around the room. It smelled of coal dust and old wood. The air was thick, unmoving. Outside, men were still working beneath lanterns, unloading crates, hauling sacks of coal toward the far shed. Tomasz stepped back outside and joined them. No one asked who he was. No one questioned his help. He moved crates, lifting slowly, deliberately, his hands stiff from the cold. He worked in silence. When the last crate was placed near the stovehouse, he returned to the storage room. His coat was damp, heavy with snow. He lit the oil lamp again, the flame stuttering before catching. Then he sat on the bench and removed his gloves, flexing his fingers as he leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. The door creaked again. Brother Emil entered, carrying a thermos wrapped in cloth. He didn't speak as he handed it over. Tomasz took it gratefully, unscrewed the lid, and drank. The broth was warm and plain, salt, potatoes, perhaps a hint of thyme. They sat together in silence. The old priest didn't preach. He didn't question. He simply sat beside him, their breaths clouding the air, their shoulders close. The lamp burned low. Later, when the priest left, Tomasz lay down on the bench. He pulled his coat around him, his scarf folded beneath his head. The flickering light painted wavering shadows along the beams. The wind moaned outside, low and hollow, dragging across the eaves like a hand searching for purchase. His breath rose steadily, clouding the space above his mouth before fading. He didn't close his eyes for a long time. When he finally did, it was without fear. Dawn was still a thin line on the edge of the world when Marta found the letter. She opened her door to find it folded neatly beneath the threshold, the name written in handwriting she recognized instantly. Small, slanted, deliberate. She crouched to pick it up, then unfolded the page with cold fingers. The ink had smudged in one corner. She began to read. The letter was folded with precision, edges aligned, inked in a hand that was unmistakably his. Careful, clean, slanted just enough to show someone who had once written with pride. The paper was thin, but not fragile, and when Marta opened it with both hands, she held it as if it might vanish if she looked away too quickly. She stood by the window as the morning light crept across the floorboards, her scarf still around her neck, the chill from the hallway lingering on her sleeves. Lucy slept down the hall, the quiet breaths of sleep carrying through the thin walls. The letter felt warm in her hands, even though the ink had dried and the message had already traveled far from where it was written. He hadn't written to say goodbye. There were no explanations, no regrets, no long apologies, just truth, shaped in simple language, each word chosen with care. Marta, thank you, not for kindness, but for truth. You saw me. You saw what I was and what I wasn't, and you allowed both to exist. For a little while I remembered what it meant to belong somewhere, not because of a name, but because of the silence between words, the small kindnesses, the trust earned slowly. Lucy reminded me that not everything has to be restored to be beautiful, that some things, perhaps the best things, are new beginnings, not recoveries. The world doesn't need princes anymore. It needs people who remember how to serve without being seen. Keep teaching her. Let her ask hard questions. Let her break things to understand how they're made. She is the story worth telling. Marta read it twice, the second time slower. She didn't cry, but her hands trembled as she folded the paper once again and pressed it into the inside cover of her husband's journal. The pages barely shifted as it slid in, as though the book had been waiting for it. A final page that belonged, even if it hadn't started there. She placed the journal back on the shelf between textbooks and lesson plans, her hand resting briefly on the spine before letting go. The next days passed without spectacle. Snow fell, melted, and fell again. The air carried the sharp tang of coal smoke and early frost, and the sky hung low over the rooftops like a breath held too long. Marta moved through her routine, teaching in the mornings, walking through the market on her way home, greeting neighbors with small nods and brief, passing words. She carried her satchel over her shoulder. Her boots tracked salt through the schoolhouse doorway, and her scarf always smelled faintly of ash. But something had shifted. The world was no softer, no quieter, but the edges didn't press against her quite as hard. Her steps weren't lighter, but they landed with more certainty. Her voice in the classroom carried further. She lingered longer at the windows. At night, the stove crackled in the corner of their small parlor. Lucy would sit by the window, bent over her drawings, her pencil moving carefully across the page. Sometimes Marta watched from the table, pretending to read, her gaze flicking up every few minutes to see what shape had begun to emerge. The figures in Lucy's drawings varied. Sometimes it was just her and Marta, a kitchen table, a tree, the cat that slept under the porch steps. Other times there were 3 figures, always in the same arrangement. One small, one tall, one in the middle, never named, never explained. The paper crown remained on the mantel above the fireplace. Still taped at the seams, the stars faded, but intact. Marta never moved it. Lucy never asked to wear it again. Each day after school, Lucy stopped by the square. Even when the snow had hardened to ice, even when her boots slipped on the path, she walked there. She sat on the bench that faced the church, the one dusted white every morning, and waited. She didn't speak. She didn't fidget. She only sat, sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes longer, watching the lanterns sway in the wind, her breath curling upward, her mittens tucked beneath her knees. The bench remained empty beside her. But she came anyway. It was Brother Emil who told Marta first. They passed each other on the church steps one morning, his hands carrying a bundle of kindling, her satchel heavy with papers. He paused just long enough to nod in greeting, then added gently, "He's been near the rail yard, the chapel, helping with the refugees, quietly, nothing official, but they trust him." Marta didn't reply. She simply nodded and continued on. But that night, as the wind shifted and the snow returned, she took the bread from the shelf, the one she had set aside, and wrapped it in cloth. She found an extra wool scarf in the drawer, the one she had knitted during the long nights after her husband died, and rolled it tight. She said nothing to Lucy as she packed the items. Only when she reached for her coat did Lucy speak. "Are we going?" Marta looked at her. Yes. They walked together beneath a sky thick with snow clouds. The flakes began to fall again as they reached the edge of town, the street lamps fading behind them in the distance. The path to the rail yard was slick, the lanterns hung low, the world reduced to quiet breath and the sound of boots pressing into packed ice. The chapel stood near the freight lines, its shape barely distinguishable in the white. The wooden siding had darkened with moisture, the steps half buried. A single lamp burned inside, throwing a line of gold against the wall. Tomasz was there. He didn't see them at first. He was bent beside a wooden crate, lifting its edge to the wall where the others had been stacked. His coat was patched, his shoulders more defined, his movements slower but sure. His face, leaner now, caught the light as he turned. When he saw them, he didn't speak. He didn't step forward. He only set the crate down carefully and stood, wiping his hands against his sleeves. Marta said nothing. Lucy didn't run to him. She didn't wave. She simply stood at her mother's side and looked at him as the snow began to fall again. Heavy, wet flakes that softened the lines of the chapel, the crates, the tracks. Tomasz gave a small nod, barely more than a breath. They stepped forward and sat on the low edge of the platform, beside him, saying nothing, needing nothing. Just the sound of snow settling on wood, the weight of silence shared, the closeness of three people who had already said everything they needed to say. And above them, the sky lowered once again, as if to fold them into the same snowfall that had brought them together the year before. 1 year had passed. It arrived without fanfare, measured not in dates, but in the quiet accumulation of mornings, in new footprints across old snow, in the way a shutter creaked open a little sooner than it had the winter before. Valašská Lhota, still tucked deep within the folds of the hills, had changed only in the smallest of ways. The town was quieter now, but not in the hollow, fearful silence that had once blanketed it. This quiet carried the weight of thoughtfulness, of caution earned through loss, but also of hope drawn in thin lines. The town square, once frozen in time, had softened with care. The old fir tree had survived another season, replanted after the last of the frost retreated in spring. Its trunk stood straighter now, supported by wooden stakes and carefully packed soil. Beneath its branches, someone had added a second bench, built from reclaimed wood, mismatched but sturdy. It sat beside the original one, mirroring its shape, as though it had always belonged there. The benches were often empty in the mornings, dusted with snow, but by evening someone had usually come to sit, with a book, a thermos, a newspaper. The paper lanterns strung from the posts around the square were fewer this year, but brighter. They held color, red, amber, pale blue, and swayed gently in the wind without tearing. Some of the ornaments from the previous winter had been collected and saved, now part of the town's new rhythm, passed between neighbors like recipes and wool. There were still scars. No one pretended there weren't. A building near the edge of the market remained unoccupied, its roof bowed from the weight of last year's storms. Some windows still stayed dark, no smoke rising from their chimneys. Certain names were still said with care, or not at all, but the air didn't feel held anymore. The schoolhouse near the church had gained 2 new rows of desks over the summer. The chalkboards, once cracked and bowed, had been sanded and repainted. Marta taught most mornings in the front room, her scarf always looped neatly at her neck, her voice steady, if quieter than the younger teachers. She still carried the same satchel, its leather patched at the corners, the strap darkened with years of use. Her lessons had grown. Beyond numbers and grammar, she taught the children about names, the ones history kept, and the ones it forgot. She read aloud from old journals and letters, not to relive the past, but to ask what could be carried forward. She told them about choices. Not always grand, sometimes only whether to speak or to remain silent. She asked them to write their own stories, and when they hesitated, she would remind them, it's not who you were born as, but who you become when no one's watching. Her students listened. In the hallway outside her classroom, just beside the seasonal wreath made of pine and dried apples, hung one of Lucy's drawings. It was newer than the others, more precise. A man sat on a bench beneath a tree, a paper crown balanced on his lap. Snow fell around him. A smaller figure sat beside him, boots barely touching the ground. The background was light gray, the edges of the buildings just visible, softened by white. Beneath it, in neat handwriting, were the words, "He gave everything quietly." Lucy, taller now, wore her scarf with more confidence. Her drawings had changed, more details, stronger lines, but she still left room in the corners for the things unseen. She didn't run in the halls anymore, but she still paused by the windows longer than most. Her gaze was steady, but when she smiled, her whole face changed. She visited the square most days after class. Sometimes she brought a notebook. Sometimes she didn't. She would sit on the newer bench, always that one, and watch the lanterns shift in the wind. Occasionally she waved at passers-by. More often, she simply watched. She never waited for anyone, but she always looked like she was waiting. On Christmas Eve, the square was quiet again. A fresh snow had fallen earlier in the day, blanketing the cobblestones in soft, unbroken white. The buildings were dimly lit, a few windows glowing golden with candlelight. The town hall had been closed early. The bakery's chimney puffed faintly in the distance. And from the Svobodova's window just above the schoolteacher's apartment, a soft yellow light flickered behind drawn curtains. Tomasz returned just after dusk. His coat had been mended, the seam at the sleeve no longer torn, the buttons replaced with new ones, though not all matched. His boots were the same, but they held the ground more firmly now. His scarf was darker than before, pulled snug beneath his collar, and his gait no longer carried hesitation. He crossed the square without drawing attention. The snow crunched faintly underfoot, each step measured. When he reached the bench beneath the spruce, he paused, brushing off a thin layer of snow before sitting down. He said nothing. He only looked toward the Svobodova's window, the faint light warm and still. The spruce branches hung low, heavy with snow, but unbroken. The paper lanterns above swayed slowly, casting shifting glows across the stone. A few minutes passed. Then Lucy appeared. She stepped lightly down the path from the schoolhouse, her boots pressing clean prints behind her. Her coat was buttoned tightly, her hat pulled low, but her face was clear. No surprise, no hesitation. She walked toward him not quickly but directly, her eyes never leaving his. Tomasz looked up when she approached. She sat beside him without asking, without speaking. The wind moved gently through the spruce branches above them. The snow thickened, not hurried, just enough to blur the hard outlines of the buildings, to soften the world. The lanterns cast shifting shadows across the ground, and somewhere in the distance, a bell rang from the chapel tower, its tone low and familiar. They sat in silence. No words passed between them. There was no need. Together, they looked out at the town, not as it had been, but as it was. And in the hush of falling snow, beneath the flickering light of the lanterns, Tomasz let the quiet settle around him not as weight, but as warmth. For the first time in years, he did not feel alone. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of the story? Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. On a scale of 0 to 10, how would you rate this story? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give it a like to show your support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotions and life lessons. And before we say goodbye, we'd like to remind you that on the end screen, you'll see a recommendation for another exciting and charming story. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.